Hello, friends. This is Andrew Sweeney from Parallax Academy. This is just a quick reminder to subscribe and like our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to keep abreast of all of our activities. And if you want to get more involved, Parallax Academy has a membership program, coaching and mentorship, as well as several new courses and study groups. Come and join our convivial hub and network with some of the best thinkers, movers, and visionaries in the world today. And please consider contributing by becoming a patron or making a donation. Join us to help rebuild spirituality, rethink philosophy, and reimagine culture. The links to all of our activities are in the description below. Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to Parallax. And I'm here with Jamie Wheal, the very talented author of all kinds of books: Recapture the Rapture, Stealing Fire. I won't go into depth into your extensive biography, but what I wanted to talk to you today is about a few things. We have this series called Deep Futures of Parallax, where we're talking to people about the kind of AI hype thing that's going on. So I want to talk to you about that and a little bit. And also, the last time we spoke, we talked about America and what's going on in America and the certain the subcultures and religions and cults of America. And so that those are kind of the things I wanted to talk to you about, including the rapture and the apocalypse and the end of the world, and some of the things that you've been talking to about other people about. So where are you at? Maybe I could just ask you the first question here. When is the apocalypse coming? Are you waiting for the rapture, or what's going on? And how you also talk about having hope. So you paint a lot of stark. You have a lot of stark images about what we're doing and where we're going, and then you also talk about hope. So what's the deal there?
Well, I think it's Wendell Berry 101. It's be joyful though you have considered all the facts.
Nice.
So phase one is consider all the fucking facts. Like, wake up, humans. Like, there's a whole bunch going on right now that is, consequential and, teetering to cataclysmic. So we should be aware. And that Wendell Berry quote dovetails really nicely with the Stockdale paradox, which was named after Admiral James Stockdale. He was the highest ranking POW in Vietnam. Jim Collins popularized his story in his business book, Good to Great, which was kind of like the tipping point for business geeks a decade ago. And it was basically this idea is that because he was the highest ranking officer in the North Vietnamese POW camps, he, obviously took the brunt of a ton of stuff, but also was responsible for managing the troops and morale of all the men who were imprisoned with him. And he noticed that the pessimists didn't survive. So that made sense. But what he also noticed, and the real insight, was that the optimists didn't either. Because if they were like, oh, well, we'll be home by Christmas, or we'll be home by Easter, or we'll be home for July the 4th, right? And then those dates came and went, then they would collapse. They had nothing underneath it to support them. So what he noticed is the people who survived versus the ones who didn't were the people who were ruthlessly objective about current realities while remaining relentlessly optimistic about eventual long-term solution. And to me, that's really important, right? Because we've got a lot of kind of hope these days, a lot of new age spiritual bypassing, a lot of magical thinking, a lot of law of attraction, and we can change our realities and we can all just move to Costa Rica and live in the fifth density and none of this shit will hit us, all of that. And we saw spasms of that with COVID, conspiracisms in all directions. But one of the threads was, if I keep my vibes high, I'm immune. That's a super simplification of it, but you could see this.
Mm-hmm.
And so my general assessment over the last, say, 5 to 7 years has just been, okay, we are absolutely leaning into increasingly consequential terrain. Naive optimism will be utterly unfit for purpose and will get ripped out of our hands in the first flash flood, tsunami, or typhoon. And we need something more durable. We need to grow up quickly, and we need to have means and mechanisms by which we can both cognitively hold what the hell's going on and all of its complexities and contradictions. We have to have the ability to metabolize our grief along the way, or we will all end up buckled and dysfunctional by the sheer overwhelm of everything that is happening and the paradise lost all around us. And just even just the loss of, post World War II, World Bank, Bretton Woods, Pax Americana, happy days are here again, limitless consumption, one-click shipping, like, all of that. Right, like the world that we grew up in was the freak anomaly, not our birthright. And then ultimately, and how do we do this in coordination and collaboration with other people without fracturing along the normal fault lines of tribal politics, times existential crisis, times undigested grief? So to me, that's arguably, the project. How can we figure all this shit out without blowing ourselves up while transitioning off a carbon-based economy, fossil fuel boom of the last century, without tanking the techno-industrial capacities of our current civilization to be able to invent our way out of the pickle we just put ourselves in?
Mm-hmm. So there's also, you talked about relentless optimism and looking at the facts, and then you also brought up grief, so what's the importance of grief here? Why does grief matter?
Well, I mean, there was that old hippie bumper sticker in Boulder and Ithaca and other places, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, right? And and the other one was sort of think globally, act locally. And I think you could substitute, because if you're not just brokenhearted, you're not paying attention, right? And the amount of tragedy in the world for other humans, but for nature, for animals, for ecologies, like, it's a lot. And there's an awful lot of loss. And one way or another, we're kind of holding the tab on it. Like, this is just clever monkeys, too fucking clever for our own good. And the law of unintended consequences plus externalities, all coming due / plus blowback, right? Like with CIA and Afghanistan and stuff like that, right? So we're like, oh, okay, we're very much getting hoisted on our own petard here. And there's a bunch of things that may not be kind of coming back or recovering or persisting in ways that we might have loved or taken for granted. So no more Finding Nemo fish on coral reefs. No more, beautiful orangutans in the jungle of Borneo. No more, glaciers in Glacier National Park. Potentially, that beautiful redwood grove you went to in Sequoia burned to the ground. Like, just stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So grief and the ability to metabolize our grief becomes essential. And I don't know if you do know Zach Stein.
Yeah, very well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to see Zach in a week, actually, in
great.
Vermont. Yeah.
Right. So Zach said a phrase a few years ago, which definitely stuck with me, but he's like, we may be entering an era where billions watch while millions die.
Yeah. I remember him saying that. Yeah.
And you're like, and that might be optimistic. It might be.
Sorry to interrupt. Excuse me. Yeah. It was just interesting that when I interviewed him and he said that on my podcast, it was right before COVID. And I remember talking to him, and then COVID came, and it's like, oh, was he right about that? And it turns out that it wasn't exactly COVID. It seems to be something else, but that is the watching of millions. Anyway.
But so how do we not fracture? How do we not succumb to diseases of despair? Yeah. How do we still maintain hope and agency, even though things don't look like they're going great for us right now? Yeah. So that feels important, and so to take that second bumper sticker of think globally, act locally, it might be grieve globally, thrive locally, right? Like, take in the wound of the world. Like, don't duck, don't look away from, from the suffering of our fellow humankind and whatever, however far out you care. Right. And on the other hand, right, thrive locally, like put down roots, like the ability to be like, either we come up with a gee whiz Silicon Valley solution that quote unquote scales, or we just throw up our hands in despair and go suck on a tailpipe, like you're like, somewhere in between is what can we do? And what can we do is almost always closer to home and re-knitting community into healthy tribes, right? Versus constantly holding out for some beautiful new age where we've all ascended to global centric consciousness, and everybody's got their t-shirt of Einstein, you can't solve the problem at the level that created it. So let's all just, do cacao ceremonies until we figure this shit out. Like, I'm not putting any chips on the spiritual transcendent expansion of consciousness global connectivity thing at this point. It just seems slim to absolutely impossible, barring some rapturous phase change. But what is reasonable, and I think eminently practical and even necessary, is healthy bioregional tribalism. So rather than aspirational globalism, which is increasingly seeming like a fucking pipe dream, you're like, we had a crack at it, we didn't pull it off in time. So what is the self-arrest to get us to where can we actually take a stand? And where we could take a stand is in healthy pro-social tribalism. We know that blood and soil tribalism doesn't end well. We know that caste and creed tribalism tends not to end well. But if it's more of the we live here, we give here, like help a neighbor out, bond raisings and bucket brigades, right? We can find some commonality there. Where's our watershed? Where's our food come from? How are our kids, educated? How do we break bread? How do we grieve, celebrate, etc.? Like just reknitting actual healthy community feels like a super hopeful, really fun, but also like vitally necessary mutual aid society.
It seems to me that what you've described is the positive thing that I've seen in America. I'm living in Europe, so I'm an expatriate. I'm a Canadian, but I've traveled all around America. And there's one aspect of America which is very tribal. It's just it started off as a bunch of Puritan cults, right? And I guess I want to bring it back to America because I was also reading something written in Rolling Stone where you were kind of accused of being individualistic, right? But I think there's also this communal aspect of America, and I thought, well, Jamie's not individualistic. That's not quite right, but there is a sort of self-sufficiency.
Oh, do you mean I personally was being accused of being individualistic,
I
or
just read
America?
something about you where Jamie. I can even quote it because I was just looking up a few things about you before the conversation. It said largely apolitical and hyper individualistic. You were
Hmm,
called that in Rolling Stone. It was in a review, and I thought no,
hmm,
that's not Jamie,
yeah.
but it's an attack of I think it's an attack of against libertarianism, putting you in that kind of a bucket
Oh,
or
yeah,
something.
the most baffling one is where I get where the brush I get tied with sometimes is like booster to Silicon Valley tech bros or something. I'm like, oh my God, do you ever hear a thing I say about them? I
Yeah.
would not be classified as a booster. But no, I think to your point, you've signaled a couple of times your curiosity about like the American mind, American culture. A
Hmm.
book that I've just been reading and geeking on and really enjoying is Kurt Anderson. He does Studio 360 for NPR, that podcast. But he's like Harvard Lampoon editor back in the days, written for New Yorker, Vanity Fair, that kind of thing. So he's very much of the kind of, New York chattering classes, but he wrote a book called Fantasyland, 500 Years of How America Went Haywire. And it
Hmm.
starts with the Puritans, but it goes through the 19th century. It goes through the New Thought movements. It goes through the schism of mainline Protestant Christianity, which was really quite grounded, right, and was happy to embrace and integrate science and the scientific revolution and facts, to the whole Scopes monkey trial, and the fact that, and I didn't know this, but like the fact that the whole fueling of the Pentecostal and evangelical movements, right, was actually an aftershock of the Civil War and part of failed Reconstruction. So it was sort of like the southern band of states rejected mainline Protestantism, which they've gone through their Reformation, right? They had integrated faith and reason, and to these throwback fringe sects that then mushroomed up, and then unholy alliance with New Thought movement. So like there are no facts, it's alternative facts. Like evolution is just a theory, we get to believe what we want to believe. Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, Change Your Mind, and all of these mutations, right, led to the 20th century, led to Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking, which Trump came up in, led to
Mhm.
new age anti-vaxxers and that whole idea of if I keep my vibes high and we can enter the fifth density, like that decoupling of base level falsifiable reality with I can imagine and make up whatever the fuck I want and then
Mhm.
insist that it is equally valid. It's a fascinating intellectual history. And then the other crazy one, I don't know if you've been tracking the flame out with Hillsong Church. Like HBO's just done a big documentary expose called Hillsong Exposed, but basically it was the
Mm.
one who they had like giant stadiums filled with people in New York City, Justin Bieber, the Kardashians, all of this kind of stuff. And then the pastor went down in flames with sex scandals and all these things. But they were tracking it back. And the funny thing is that in the same way that postmodernism, right, these days in the post-truth era has been weaponized by the alt-right, right?
Yeah.
They're help, I'm being oppressed, you know, like, and no, nothing's true. There's always just power and language games all the way up and down, signs and signifiers. Suck it, bitches. I'm just going to troll you now with your own fucking devices, you know, you liberal academy. The same fucking thing happened with evangelical Christianity, which is post 60s and 70s. You had the Jesus freaks, and the Jesus freaks were a bunch of like Woodstock refugees and acid heads who got into Christianity and faith, and you know, another fork was Zen Buddhism and all those things, but like the huge chunk were Jesus freaks, and they got into Jesus rock, and they were like, hey, we like rock and roll and music and tripping and having faith. Now we're gonna get the Holy Ghost feeling, and we're gonna strum guitars. So the Jesus freaks actually started out totally left wing, just like postmodern deconstructions and critique of objective truth and power started out on the left, but lately they've both been co-opted. And then, you know, Jesus rock, stadium music. That's how Hillsong did it. They built a global empire of over $150 million revenue by playing the best Jesus rock on the planet, to the point where they licensed it to all these other churches as well. And you're like, oh shit. So the wages of sin of the unintentional left over the last 50 years has now all been metastasized and weaponized, right, by arch conservative movements who are also kind of have a nihilistic Joker vibe to them, where they're like, we don't really believe what we're saying, but we know it fucking ties you guys up in knots. So we're going to keep saying it until we, you know, melt the snowflakes.
Well, I grew up in Canada, and I kind of like I have a weird sort of relationship, I guess, if you live over the border, and I always like the holy rollers and stuff. Like I have some sympathy for them because they're kind of in search of ecstasy, whereas the Protestants are so dull and yes, they have a bit of science and reason, but they have no religion left almost. It's like so I almost have a when I see these big Jesus things and people going into ecstasies, and there's something kind of primitive and I mean something essential in that, regardless of what the politics are and the it's I don't know what you think about that, but
I mean, I think it's fascinating, and they're the only growth industry in Christendom.
Right, because so Christianity is dying completely, except for these wild sort of emotional churches. Yeah,
absolutely. Ecstasis and catharsis, right? I mean, it's this peak state with the profound, weepy, born again, I'm saved, redemptive healing arcs that sell like hotcakes. You know, and the smells and bells, the liturgy, you know, the catechisms, that stuff is out. That's just for blue-haired church ladies at this point.
Yeah, right. So it's not that sophisticated, but how do, like I think one of your missions, or one of the things that you talk about, is ecstasis, right? And how to achieve that, and flow and ecstasy in a and you've even talked about how we could create positive cults of some kind. What would that culture be? And cult is culture, right? In a sense.
Yeah, I mean, cultus just means to worship. So the question is, how do we worship? And can we do it? And can we play with these? Can we play with fire without burning down the house? That's it, right? And can we use fire as a tool for transformation, like a little Bunsen burner under a crucible, to burn away our impurities through access to peak states, increased information, increased inspiration? And can we use those insights to then come back and mend where we're broken? And can we do it in ethical, balanced relationship and integrity with each other? So healing, inspiration, connection, can we do that? And it just feels like a super duper triple these days. In fact, I just got sent an article by Vice magazine. A journalist had interviewed me a few months back, and this just went to press, but I wouldn't say it's an expose, but it's a mild shade throwing coverage of an Austin-based church working with psychedelics for PTSD and veterans. So super well intentioned, but they made a claim that they have now created some new magic molecule by growing mushroom spores on a 5-MeO like Sonoran desert toad substrate, and that the new psychoactive chemical was non-scheduled and therefore legal to use. And then everybody's been coming to these events and professing to have really meaningful state-shifting experiences that are nonetheless definitely not mushrooms. And then Usona, that nonprofit psychedelic organization, did some third-party lab testing, and they're like, we're not finding any 5-MeO in here. It seems like you're, all we're finding is psilocin and psilocybin, core ingredients in magic mushrooms. And so I think your whole thing's like you're just spinning a yarn here.
Okay, it was a pyramid scheme completely.
Well, but I think their intentions. I am not aware of them having bad intent.
Mm-hmm.
But it is just to say, and then you throw in Instagram shamans, throw in the amount of psychedelic churches springing up, throw in, One Taste organization, which was that orgasmic meditation company. New York Times just published 2 days ago that the founder, Nicole Tidone, has just been indicted, but she's at large. So she's potentially on the lam, who knows? That's gone down. Everybody's familiar with Nexium and Osho and Wild Wild Country and all these things. The question is just, we're even in dodgier terrain than we were in the 60s and 70s as far as our tendency to fuck this up and end up with culty cults, because you have, on top of all the normal human nature stuff of power corrupting absolutely and borrowing Eastern modes of hierarchical order and and monastic submission and all that, all the stuff that we got lessons learned from that time, add in digital narcissism and the hyper commodification of the spiritual marketplace, and it's a shit show out there. So yeah, those are things I think to be wary of, because otherwise we're going to end up with a bunch of ecstatic millenarian death cults.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with you before we pressed record about the Gurdjieff, who was a early, let's say, guru of sorts, and one of the people I know who was in the Gurdjieff work for many years is sort of leaving the community because he's finding that like everything changed a few years ago. Like everything is just has gone kind of nuts. I mean, I don't know if when Timothy Leary said that the internet is LSD or it has something to do with that, but whatever was happening when, let's say, early Buddhism came in and all these like Eastern teachers came in, there was something probably powerful and new and extraordinary about that. And it seems to me that whatever, wherever that is, that's in hiding at the moment, and something else is going on. Do you have any thoughts about yeah? So how, I guess the question is, how do we practice in the internet? What practices? That's one of the things you think about and talk about is psychotechnologies and practices, and what practices should we do and how should we do them, and should we do them with masters and in lineages or on our own? Or I mean, there's also a lot of people starting their own kind of things, and some of them are quite intelligent and other of them are quite culty, and some of them are related to perennial religion and some of them aren't. And that's a long-winded question, but any thoughts on all of that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, we're all going to do what we feel like doing, right? And especially in this era of, toppling all hierarchies, and critiques of power in almost any form, almost to the point of pathology. It's like, fucking hell, somebody's got to be in charge and row the boat, like there's some element of like functional hierarchies versus dysfunctional hierarchies. And we should probably figure out actually how to do dynamic subordination, which is something I wrote about in Stealing Fire, which SEAL Team 6 used well, which is who knows what to do next is in charge, but no one then stays stuck on the throne, so we each take turns sitting on the Iron Throne, but no one gets butthurt, right? So that's one level. The other is poverty, chastity, and humility, right? And in some respects even obedience, right, have been vows of the monastics around the world since time began, because their opposites will fuck you up. So poverty, so money, sex, power and pride, or just obstreperousness, willfulness, right, will undo you if you're trying to search for God. So promise up front to take those off the table, and then come inside these cloistered walls, and maybe we'll have a chance to hear God's quiet whisper, right? These days it's wheels off. We're playing with all of it, and people are having, crazy life-changing experiences, in the jungles of the Amazon or on, in the deserts of Burning Man. And, no sooner are they blown wide open, potentially reborn, that out of just habit or even just unclarified ego/transaction are back online, posting their breathless update from their latest
Yeah.
downloads.
Yeah.
And then, click on the link in the comments below to attend my next workshop on downloading your star codes, and the shamelessness of it even goes as far as, oh, not only am I going to know, like the skin is not even, on the cream yet. Like I'm arguably have just glimpsed massive grace, but it's already skinning around the echo chamber of my digitally mediated self. Right. But I might even totally, in a sort of Machiavellian way, I might deliberately overshare. So like I'm snot pulling down my nose, I'm ugly crying. I'm like, this is, that'll get you to listen. And then I'm going to overshare with some performative vulnerability, which is actually to say, I realized that I was so full of shit. I've just been chasing fame and greed for these last 3-4 years. I've realized that none of this was authentic. And you're like, wait a second, I've seen you online. I fucking have seen you in person. You've been fronting that you've been an awakened Jedi that whole time. Now you're copping to the fact that you were full of shit and didn't know what you didn't know. And without skipping a beat, you're transitioning that into your next offering or product or money grab.
Yeah.
And you're like, that is just some mind-bendingly shameless shit. And so the idea, to your point, you threw out the notion of should we learn in lineages? I think, fuck yes. Right? We should absolutely have checks and balances. I mean, if some young seeker had some Kensho Satori lightning bolt flash, in most traditions, it would be come and sit in front of your elders. They would quiz you. They would check to see how you were holding it. They would confirm where you were on their ontological maps, and they would sort of help you both calibrate. And then, as often as not, would be like, "That's nice, Podwan. Go grab the mop and bucket, or go back to your cushion and sit the fuck down." Like, not, it's time for me to proclaim to the world and everybody who's watching on TikTok that I am the next enlightened master and I've attained it. You're like, that is some rookie ass moves.
Yeah.
And
I guess, Rinse, I would put your head in a bucket of cold water if you had a religious experience. Or now people are bragging about them. And I noticed that, actually. I've noticed I've had conversations with people, and they start the conversation with, I had this awakened experience. And then they start to talk about their experience. And so what do you do with that? Like, when people are starting to brag about their awakened experiences, it doesn't feel to me that that's copacetic, or there feels to be that there has to be ego involved in there somewhere, right?
Well, dude, I mean, I haven't even heard people be as precise in their languaging as what you just said, which was, I had an awakening or an awakened experience. What I hear way more often than that, because that's actually somewhat provisional.
Or had awakening. That's what they say.
Yeah.
I had
when
an
I
awakening.
woke up, people will just fucking balls out say it. They'll be like, when I woke up, when I became enlightened, when I realized, whatever, when I dropped, and you're like, wait, are you sure? Are you sure that wasn't a really meaningful peak state for you, but it's probably returned more or less to baseline, and now you're just fronting? Like also, I mean, that's the thing, dude. The stuff that is happening in the current spiritual marketplace is so ludicrously low budget that it's not only just kingdom in the kingdom of blind men, the one eye shall rule, right? It's some version of that meets Children's Crusade, and it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic, and it would be dismissible if we didn't actually have a dire need for people to actually follow through on this stuff. Because if you do take, if you take the premise of like, hey, collectively we're in a tight spot. Humanity, we have to be at our best. We have to be the most inspired, innovative, compassionate, and courageous we've maybe been in a while, if ever. And we need to pull this, and it's all of us or none of us. We've really got to figure out how to do this together. So how might we do that, given culture wars, given geopolitics, given all the crises that are actually dragging us into violent tribalism more than ever? Oh, we've got to use all the tools at our disposal. So we need to have access to peak states, ecstatic breakthroughs, spiritual initiations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to figure out something better than Prozac, and talk therapy to mend where we're broken, so we stop fucking things up, unintentionally. And we've got to figure out better ways to collaborate and coordinate and co-create. Okay, then most of that lives just by default in the Kanchi transformational, spiritual, psychedelic, contemplative tantra spaces. You're like, well, those would be the tools, but the people who have access to the tools seem to be fucking it up in an almighty fashion before we even get to the starting line of the world burning.
Well, there's a meme that's going around, and that let's say the next Buddha is the Sangha, and I don't think that's correct. you know,
That's Thich Nhat Hanh. That's
I
not
know
even
that's
up
Thich Nhat
to
Hanh. I
me.
know he's correct, but I don't think the way people are using that is correct because I think you have to have the Buddha Dharma Sangha. In other words, you have to have leadership and you have to have students and you have to have a teaching, right? And then when you have a proper context, then you can have these experiences. But maybe I'm being too uptight here, but I get the feeling that people are having, yeah, these it's just what you're describing, these unmediated wild kind of experience. And I just talked to a guy the other day. He was in one of my groups, and he just ended up in a crazy home somewhere trying to escape, because he had had a psychotic a breakdown of sorts, and I was like, okay, where's the discipline here? Like, where's the lineage? Where's the practice? Where's the
Well,
anyway?
look, dude. No, I reject your assertion. I don't think you're being uptight. It's almost like a Buddhist version of Nietzsche's God is dead, right? Like everybody thinks that was like stomping on the grave of religiosity. It wasn't, right? Like he was basically saying, be careful when you kill your God because you destroy a whole bunch of social order constructs, morals, and ethics that go with that God. And there could be hell to pay now that we've killed our God.
Yeah,
So that's actually what Nietzsche was saying. And if you say, hey, Buddha Dhamma Sangha, like the next Buddha is a Sangha, which means we all get to put on our big dumb hats and go to the festival and eat Molly and say that's saving the world, is like, no, fuck you, right? Because what's missing? Buddha, ultimate truth, and Dharma, that which I ought to be doing.
yeah,
Right. And if you decouple those, you just get the party at the end of time that devolves into the Hotel California.
mm,
Right. So I'm in full agreement with you. And I don't think that that's uptight. I don't think that's okay, boomerish. I think that's how it was. That was a three-legged stool on purpose.
yeah, yeah. And well, there just seems to be. Well, on the other hand, there's so many people that don't fit into ordinary religion, and Carl Jung would say that religion is there to protect you from God, or I heard, they don't have people don't have those religious structures, but also there's a lot of people that can't go back to those religious structures either, and are sort of in this in between worlds place, to quote Zach Stein, and so many of us are kind of there. What would you say to people like that, or where would you direct them or
Well,
suggest?
my personal preference. I mean, some of this is aesthetics, some of this is actually sincere on a kind of pedagogical level. Like, how do we help facilitate from a developmentally informed perspective, meaning that people can grow and change and progress over time? They follow roadmaps that are semi predictable and repeatable. And how can we facilitate the passage of as many people into as full maturity and agency as possible? Like, if that's the project, right? Growing homegrown humans, right? My sense is start with an MVP. What's your minimum viable philosophy? So no Baroque bells and whistles, not my favorite pet theories or downloads or visions. Just what's the fucking bare ass minimum that gets me out of bed and pointed in the right direction, right? So, and instead of, and I mean, to name check the guy twice in 3 minutes, is instead of like Pascal's wager, right, where Blaise Pascal was like, better to believe in God in case he's real, than doubt him and burn in hell if I'm wrong, right? It's almost Nietzsche's wager, which is better to create an existential philosophy without appeal to supernatural aid, right, and bootstrap this shit. And if it turns out that when I get to the pearly gates, there have been Lemurians or Pleiadians or guardian holy angels fucking having my back this whole time and silly me, then I'd rather play that game. And so for me, the MVP, the minimum viable philosophy, is just literally, at least again for me, because I'm
Mm,
pretty skeptical rationalist, even though my lived experience has been all over the place, is the one act of faith I'm willing to enact, to commit, right, is I choose to believe, not saying it's proven in maths, but I choose to believe that a world with a little more good, true, and beautiful in it is better for me and everyone than a world with a little less good, true, and beautiful in it. And so then my getting up out of bed and point me in the right direction is just, okay, now how do I be in service of, or a conduit for, or a defender of, or whatever it might be, of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And having an ontology, or a cultural kind of DNA that doesn't get out over our skis in the excessive meaning making. Like, let the mystery stay the mystery. Right? Don't try and pass it infinitely, because it's only ever going to be refracted through your genetics, epigenetics, selfhood, karma, dharma, prison house of language. Like, we know that, so just let the burning bush fucking burn, people, and let us rekindle awe and humility in the face of the numinous of the infinite, right? And then get around being better people together and for each other.
Yeah.
And so that plus the poverty, chastity, humility, like let's take some things off the table. That plus what you were saying about the Dharma. What is actually my ethical obligation to turn this light into life, right? And be in deference and service to something bigger than myself? Because I think that's obviously another, again, really dull, boring, and predictable tank trap that people are just hitting constantly right now, which is the antinomian effect of the inflationary experiences of state seeking, unearned wisdom in Jung's term, right?
Yeah.
Which is everybody's getting that, I am a golden god, you're not the boss of me, and this is all about me. And then you've got nonviolent communication and all of that metastasized prosperity gospel meets, law of attraction bullshit. And then what's true for me is indefinitely true and unchallengeable or unquestionable. And I'm running all of these fucking loops of heightened energy cultivation because we've bum rushed the fucking, the candy store. So we're playing with all the ecstatic techniques and technologies. We're getting hopped up. We're getting high on our own supply. We've got no dharmic or lineage checks and balances. So of course it goes to egoic inflation. And then we've got this entitled, kind of woke / NVC languaging about my own inner experience and my triggers and my preferences trump everything.
Sort of hyper narcissism.
Hyper narcissism, and then, no surprise, like, this doesn't end well.
Yeah.
So to come back to, like, what is a community that has a code of ethics that pledges a priori ahead of time? We agree to be governable by these shared higher standards. It's just like training in a dojo or training in a zendo, right? Like, if you come and you bow in at the door and there's a showman or an altar up front, you're saying, for now, I might have my street clothes, but I've changed into, I even changed clothes. I crossed the threshold. Maybe I'm barefoot, whatever the protocols are to signify that this is a liminal space. And on the inside of this space, we behave in a certain way, different than our pedestrian secular roles and actions.
Yeah.
And we agree to play by these rules.
Yeah.
And having those rules, and not just something that someone just pulls out of their arse or makes up from scrolling YouTube for a weekend, does feel essential, and some goddamn humility that nothing new under the sun. There's wisdom traditions that go back centuries to millennia, and we should probably start there versus thinking that we are the first humans ever to think of this shit.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking, I was thinking about the necessity for embodiment. And I was also thinking about the Gurdjieff groups and the Gurdjieff movement. And, he talked in his community, he talked about is when you're with the people in the community in this sacred space, authenticity is the most important thing. When you're out of that, then, you need to put on your mask in the world to survive. And, you're not going to be, you can't be naively like that. But maybe we need these sacred spaces to explore the truth and be fully authentic. And what I like about the Gurdjieff work is this, before you develop the metaphysical understandings, right? Before you get into the higher understandings, you do self-remembrance, and it's all about really just knowing you have a hand and feet, and and that they work together, and you have an emotional brain and an intellectual brain, and you have a body that moves, and just like really getting down to the basic, as you say, the basics of the basics.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not that hard, and so much of the sensation seeking, state seeking of kind of higher realms, right, becomes endless distraction and diversion, and doesn't solve, like, the fail point in my experience of just like both studying historically, like utopian visionary communities, transformational communities through the centuries, but then also just observationally, like what's been happening from the 60s through now, and just case study after case study, is that not only do the ecstatic communities tend to go cross-eyed and drooling on too much exposure to states, and they become ungrounded in the lower realms where you were talking about with like the discipline and the dharma and the lineage. But then there also becomes a lot of bypassing in both language and orientation, that we are spiritual, we're awake, we are select, elect, whatever it might be. And then all of those petty concerns we've transcended, but it's actually like money, power, influence, tribal affiliation, dotted line, influence. All those things are very real human things. And we continue to play them, whether we're naming them or not. And so if you bypass to this spiritual language and shared story of we're above it all, then you end up just having all that stuff below the waterline in cold conflict or passive aggressive power games. But they're still there, and they undo most of these organizations over time. But the other piece is also, we're savvy enough to realize tribal politics and dynamics are a persistent shit show, and they've undone all the ones before us, but we're different. And we're different because, get this, we're going to all defer to source. We're not going to be dealing with petty human egos. And you're like, oh, fascinating. Tell me more. And you're like, yeah, well, how do you do that? Oh, well, we get together and we do Sandpager, or we smoke toad, or we do this or that, or we do breath work, or we do tantra, or we do whatever. And then we just let spirit guide us, or fill in the blank for your appeal to supernatural aid, right? And that works for exactly 15 minutes, where everybody's high as kites, and feeling neurochemically saturated and loving. And it falls apart on Monday morning, where you instantly get the next games people play is who has closer access to source, who's holier than thou. So I hear
that's the mimetic rivalry process that Girard talks about. I think just kind of destroys community. People are always competing with each other over the goods, and if they're spiritual goods, then the competing is even more brutal often than if it's the highest, if it's God, or the guru or something like that. Then
I mean, it happened in the integral scene, right? That was a magnet for a number of, to me, there were sort of two different populations. There were people who had already had their own kind of waking up experiences / spiritual practices, whatever. They were drawn to Ken's signal as more sort of peers and colleagues.
Yeah.
And then there were a bunch of kind of fast followers who geeked on the books, but that, like, it was Ken's writing that was their predominant exposure to these realms and domains. So they were just kind of fundamentally just taking his word for it. But what happened within the organizational structures of the community was everyone started playing the who's more integral than thou game. So like, oh, I see what you're saying, but you're forgetting that level or that line, or I think you're doing a pre-trans confusion here.
You're green, or you're
or you're a mean green, or you name it. Green. But like the shibboleths and slings and arrows were easy, and then it just became a language game of who could one up or outflank each other on who had privileged access to source. So you just have the priest class game. The middlemen assert themselves and insert themselves. And so that's inadequate too, unless you all just want to spend all of your time blissed out of your skulls, in sacred circles, in which case not a lot's going to get done.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. I wonder, the integral was very ambitious in the beginning, and they kind of wanted to change the world. And then I guess what happened is the shadow of all the people emerged. The fact that it became a hyper conceptual movement of just kind of, autistic types who like to play. Sorry, that's a mean thing to say maybe, but who like to play verbal games with each other. And then where are the people? Where's the guts of the thing? And where's the that was the feeling I got from where it went.
Well, and to Gurdjieff's credit, to Osho's credit, I mean, both of them are what would we call them? Rascals. Rascals. They had mixed records, but they were in that kind of crazy wisdom left-hand path space. But both of them, and actually Crowley as well, with an even more sort of scandalous track record. But all three of those guys were like, hey, at least 20th century, at least in the West, there is a massive disconnect between cognition and embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to bring the whole human online. Now, their methods were not always sound, but that root insight is. And so anything that ends up being any, psychosocial technology, like whatever people are gathering around to do an experience together, right? That pulls you up and away.
Yeah.
It either into astral realms, so it's just you're no longer even in the sort of you're no longer fully embodied, or ego narrative inflation.
Yeah.
I or we are the select or elect, and we're responsible for some great world changing contribution. Neither of those is super helpful, and that's kind of
Yeah.
where like Osho's dynamic meditation. He's like, I don't think Westerners are cut out to sit on cushions and think about not thinking. They got to get their yayas out. They got to huff and puff, and they got to shake and shimmy, and they got to
Yeah.
and they got to hoot and holler, and then maybe
Yeah.
you can sit the fuck down and be
Yeah.
quiet for a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I wonder if Osho's biggest contribution was his kind of therapy, because all those movements that he got people to do. I'm fond of the rascal teachers because they're always challenging you, and I was talking to the Zen guy the other day about Jack Cornfield, and I don't want to put Jack Cornfield down. He's a great teacher, but sort of how they're getting close to powerful people, and then everything gets soft, everything gets accommodating, and everything gets sort of easy, and yet I think people need to be challenged, and people need to have, so there's a very fine line. I think maybe perhaps is would you submit yourself to a teacher that really challenges you?
Yeah, well, that reminds me. There was a little skinny book that Andrew Cohen wrote way back when. So kind of like back when What is Enlightenment was maybe just getting started, or even slightly before it. But it was kind of like in the relative golden years. Because I always appreciated What is Enlightenment just as a solid, journalistic cut at
Yep, yep.
describing the stuff in the space. So without qualification, I enjoyed that mag, right? But this little book was called In Defense of the Guru Principle.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, in hindsight, we can all be like, oh, you jammy little bastard. You were just,
In
you were
defense of
just
Andrew Cohen. Yeah.
right. You were just
Yeah.
just justifying your own little your own Yertle the Turtle play. But I it made me think at the time, because he's like, exactly. In fact, he might have even been critiquing Jack Cornfield explicitly, or at least implicitly. But it was that sense of like, hey, wait, if we've stopped seeking, balls out, non-dual waking up, and we've settled for that after the ecstasy, the laundry kind of thing of like, wherever we go, here we are. Self-acceptance and self-compassion is as or more important than any contact with the burning bush, that kind of thing. And he was pushing back on that. And he's like, we shouldn't give up the no holds barred aspiration for the all. And that made me think, I'm like, okay, well, so what are at least, a couple of the key functions of deference to a guru that we might have outgrown the form, an individual self-appointed God, man, or woman, because that's it's been consistently problematic, but we still need the functions. So if we're going to, baby bathwater this thing, what was the functionality of the guru? Why does it help? And how can we, if we're going to abandon deference to an actual skin encapsulated ego, another person, how do we still make sure we preserve the functionality that was so useful? And to your point, I think there's at least a couple of essential ones. And the first is the deference to someone other than you to lead you through your moments is the kind of Ulysses effect, right? Like, I don't trust myself to go through ego dissolving practices or experiences and not have my ego sabotage it right at the moment of potential inflection or transformation. Right. So therefore, I should lash my hands to the mast, because I have enough self-knowledge to know I or anyone, I'm not going to be reliable in the crux to make the right decision. So that's where the obedience, right, and the submission to the guru principle, not necessarily the person anymore, feels essential. And the other is typically hand in glove with that is, when you submitted to a guru, you submitted to a tradition or set of practices end to end. So you didn't do the spiritual cafeteria, pick and choose. I'm my own guru. I sort of sample the world's buffet, because John Lilly said that. He said, look, any reality tunnel, right, you have to commit to fully in order for it to disclose whatever the protocols are supposed to disclose. You can't slap together different bits of code and then hope that you still, you don't get gobbledygook.
Totally
coming
agree.
out the other end, right?
Yeah, like Nundro, for example, is a practice in the Vajrayana tradition, and you do 100,000 prostrations, and a lot of the people came to America and tried to make it easy and just do less prostrations or forget that part of the practice, and just because they thought that, oh, Americans can't do that. But I think people have been doing those practices for 1,200 years. So if people have been doing it for 1,200 years, tested in this laboratory of practice, and it probably works if you do it properly and correctly and with all the protocol. That's sort of. But if you just try to take parts of it and make up the parts you like, it's probably not going to work. Or it's even. Yeah, so I fully agree with you there.
Well, and I've been I even experienced this in the last month, just traveling the world. We were sort of in Colombia and then Istanbul and Lisbon, and just kind of just into a series of events, more or less along these lines. And what I noticed in a handful of them was like, oh wow, I'm now witnessing the copy of the copy of the copy of the thing, and from a video camera, which is of course what everything is just optimized for Instagram at this point, right? From a video camera point of view, like this particular nighttime gathering with a DJ and everybody wearing fancy festive wear, etc., looks absolutely chapter and verse. All the markers and signifiers, pennants and medallions of like Burning Man culture.
Yeah.
But I know who's here. And I know how this feels. This is a bunch of fucking muggles playing dress up to a transformational initiatory experience they have never fucking hit with a stick, and is being commodified and sold to them, right, as a thing that it is not. This is the empty husk. This is the church that has never seen Christ consciousness inside its walls.
It's like the VR version of Burning Man or something.
Yeah, and you're like, oh fuck, that's where we are. Like, this is late stage capitalism devouring even its most potent postmodern mutated transformation engines like Burning Man. Like, like that is clearly, I mean, you're like, where is this? Is this like 5th century BC? And this is like, Hebrew stuff? Is this 25th century, like some crazy galactic carnival? Like, can't tell, and it just got birthed out of San Francisco psychedelic culture over the last few decades, right? But the fact that too is getting knocked off, commodified, flattened, and milked of all of its actual transgressive power is just one of those things. To me, it feels like that Kurt Vonnegut thing from Cat's Cradle, right? Where the CIA has developed that secret molecule called Ice-9 that then turns all of the water on the earth to ice and kills everything, right? And it's a whole knockoff on cults. Like, that whole story is the story of the religion on the island, and the guys, they're both the good guys and the bad guys. And it's just Vonnegut's most cynical, absurdist commentary on religion and cults, right? But the Ice-9 thing is to me the dominant metaphor these days, which is our ability to reinstantiate our egoic selves, amplified, enhanced, and incented by this digital spiritual marketplace, very specifically, like that thing, right? Which Jonathan Haidt and others are talking about, all the negative psychological effects to adolescents and developmental humans, but it's also just fucking up adults left and right also, right? The fact that no matter what, like, you can be down in the rainforest with a lineage shaman, having had your mind, heart, and soul blown to smithereens by the jungle vines, and then within 24 hours be stitching it all together and commodifying it. Or you can go to Burning Man and have what could be the most post-apocalyptic galactic fucking baptism, and then be like, oh yeah, by the way, that art's rad, I want some at my next festival or event, and that sculpture is killer, I want it on my lawn, and oh, by the way, this is amazing, and I'm just gonna take this like a shopping expedition, right, to my secular greater glory. Or I'm rolling back next year with a fucking art car and a bunch of hotties because that looked fun. And you're like, oh shit, humans, like we are outpacing our capacity to get ahead of ourselves and free from ourselves. So no matter how fast or how thoroughly we're able to exfoliate, right, our skin encapsulated egos, we are ice-nining them and re-imprisoning ourselves in the hall of mirrors of digital narcissism. And that I do find deeply concerning. It's even happening in like outdoor adventure, right? You could go like, oh, never mind psychedelics and transformational culture. How about something more real and pure? Do the Walt Whitman, do the Thoreau, do the romantics, get back to nature, swing from a redwood tree in a lightning storm like John Muir, do that shit. And you're like, oh, fuck, you know what's happening now? You got all these asshat Instagrammers who are like going up crazy dangerous peaks or whitewater situations, and they're blowing up the spot. So like some secret hot spring in the backcountry is now geotagged, and it's getting trampled with thousands of other Instagrammers who are not coming to have the experience figuring ground of swap now. So they're not even going to have the experience they just learned about. They're going to have the backdrop for their digital representation to then pump to other people. So they're not even there when they're there. But then half the time they're also getting to places like I saw this on YouTube, Capitol Peak in near Aspen, and that looked rad. And I'm standing on the summit and I've seen a bunch of YouTube hits. So I'm going to go do it. What they don't realize is that the last 100 feet are a no-fall death zone, and they've had like 15 fatalities in a month because, and the metaphor is clear for spiritual seeking as well. Like I saw other people do it. It looked fucking rad. I want to be rad. Let me go do it without any preparation or awareness of the consequences. So like even nature as refuge, even the natural sublime as pure and pristine a thing as we could hope it could be, uncorruptible because it's not cultural, right?
It's being
Even
sold and
that's getting
destroyed.
fucked up. Yeah, even that's getting fucked up and destroyed by the same hungry ghost, Ice Nine, digital narcissism consumption. So I don't know a way out of that pickle. I honestly don't.
So that's like that's a
terrified by
grim
it.
picture we're painting here, and I you can't help agree with it. What I'm wondering, like coming back to, let's say, the hope, or
Mhm.
where do we go for authenticity today,
Yeah.
and where what can we do about all that? I
Yeah, well,
mean,
this can be my closing statement because I need to transition after this. But I think there's the good news is the really beautiful news is the things that I think are most durable, most hopeful are also closest to home. It's loving our children. It's making a life with a partner. It's breaking bread with our neighbors. It's making amends, with our families, right? It's making the art that's ours to do. And I don't mean art as just necessarily big canvases. It's anything that it leaves the world a little more good, true, or beautiful. It's anything that rallies against the law of thermodynamics that everything ends up in entropy and chaos. Like just making order, making something that is good, making something that is true, making something that is beautiful. That's art. So let's do that. And then if we know how to do those things, then help others who are having a harder time doing those things, and start at home and start in our communities and start in our bioregions, and commit to living on behalf of something bigger than our own instant gratification. And that's how humans have always done it. And most humans, except for the last 50 to 75 years of hyper individualistic conditioned consumer zoo animals, which is really a freakish anomaly. Like we wouldn't last a goddamn minute in any other century. We would be just dead meat. We are fucking clueless, right? So you're like, okay, all humans forever were struggling through mortal stakes and turbulent conditions, and we typically did it on behalf of our children and our children's children. And that's where we got the courage, and that's where we got the perseverance, and that's where we got the impetus/injunction to embrace radical hope. Because it's like, how long, not long, right? I may not get there with you, right? Good old MLK 101, right? Like Moses in the promised land, but I'm gonna fucking keep being good, true, and beautiful, even if I get my ass kicked, even if I'm a sacrifice fly, even if I'm grist for the mill. I am passing the torch to the ones that I love in service of them having a better crack at it. And that to
beautiful.
me, that's humans. It's how we've always done it. And it's just a matter of ripping off the Band-Aid of the Pax Americana and getting real about what's ours to do going forward.
Ripping off the band-aid of the Pax Americana. I don't know where you come up with these phrases, Jamie, but I think in a way you're a holy roller preacher in the best possible sense of the word. Just your gift with rhetoric is kind of blows me away. So anyway, but and all the things you say seem pretty true to me for the most part. I'm sorry this conversation is far too short for me. I'd like to talk to you for another 2 hours, but
Yeah.
you got to run. So
Well, thanks, man. I always enjoy it. I mean, I love our overlapping and extended communities, and I think some of the heartfelt conversations that are taking place in these little pockets here and there. Hopefully we all get a little bit better informed and better kind of connected and inspired by keeping them all going.
do you want to just last thing, maybe say something where people could find you, or what you're up to, or anything for people who are interested in following up and learning more about your work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in kind of this particular topic set, on the state of the world and what do we do about it and architecting culture, I wrote a book last year called Recapture the Rapture. And you can find that actually at recapturetherapture.com or Amazon or whatever. I think our website has like additional infographics and images and various other tools and bits and pieces, but for sure you can just check it on in normal places. And the Flow Genome Project is our leadership and training organization. So we kind of take neuroscience, peak performance, and dynamic emotions like, SEAL Team 6 training and the Grand Canyon and various other fun things to try and put this on the ground and actually lead the leaders who are, conducting some of these experiments. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Jamie, for taking the time, and have a good one. Hope we can do it again sometime.
For sure, man.
All the
Be
best.
well. Cheers, Andrew.
Cheers.